Welcome. I'm Rex Bear. In the next few hours, I'm going to shake things up. I'm going to ask the questions that need asking. I'm going to change your perception about the world around you and blow your mind wide open. I'm going to take you places that will expand your reality. This is Disclosure Radio. Tonight's guest is Tony Ortega. He is an executive editor of the Raw Story, rawstory.com, and was formerly the editor of The Village Voice. He has written about Scientology since 1995 and is currently working on a book about the church. He continues to monitor breaking developments around the world from an undisclosed location in an underground bunker tucked away somewhere safe. Hello, Tony. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Thanks for having me on.
All right, fantastic. Please tell us about yourself and tell us what brought you in this quest of researching Scientology for almost 20 years, please.
Yeah, I'm a newspaper reporter. I have been for quite a while, and originally from Los Angeles. I started my career as a reporter in Phoenix, Arizona in 1995, and almost right away fell into a great story that involved Scientology. It was about a man named Rick Ross, who today is probably the most well-known cult deprogrammer in the country, cult expert. And I wrote the first extensive profile of him ever done. And his story had some involvement with Scientology. That got me interested in it. I'd always sort of been interested in it. I'd read about it. I thought it was interesting. I mean, anything that's kind of secretive and like that rouses my interest. And once you do one story, you tend to get a lot of people contacting you with additional information. And so one story just kind of led to another. And 19 years later, I'm still writing about Scientology. I went to the Village Voice in 2007, and I'd already done, a dozen stories over several years. And a year later is when the big Tom Cruise thing happened. Early in 2008, there was a 9-minute video that was leaked about Tom Cruise, and when Scientology tried to censor it, it gave rise to the Anonymous movement, the Project Chanology from Anonymous, and people in masks were protesting all around the world. And, suddenly interest in Scientology had skyrocketed. And I had all these sources and stories that I had not yet published. And so I started to put it on the Village Voice website, and they did so well. And it just got me interested in looking into what was going on. Well, it just so happened that in that next couple of years, in 2010, is when this real crisis for Scientology started to happen. In particular, some top-level executives left the church and began talking publicly about what was really going on inside. And the result, it prompted some bizarre, occurrences. There was a man in Texas named Marty Rathman who had been the number 2 guy in the church. He started to speak out, and suddenly his house was under siege by a group of Scientologists wearing strange outfits day after day on his front porch in South Texas, in Ingleside by the Sea, it's called, down near Corpus Christi. And I realized this was going on, and even though I was in New York, I realized that this was a huge story. It was a kind of a unique story in the history of American religion, really, that this former member of a church spoke up about his criticisms, and then suddenly there were a group of church members besieging his house day after day after day, week after week. So I started reporting on it daily in New York in the summer of 2011, and I was really the only one doing it. And it built this huge audience. And so I realized that not only was Scientology an interesting subject, but it's going through its worst set of crises in its history right now. and I realized I had a front row seat for it. And so I just decided that it really was not very difficult to write something every day about what was going on in Scientology. So I became a very dedicated daily blogger about what was going on. And 3 years later, I'm still doing it. And it's just a remarkable story. There are other journalists covering it, but I've really had a unique perspective on it because I've been covering the various lawsuits so carefully, so closely. And it's really a remarkable part of their history. And I think Scientology is so interesting to people because it has a reputation for being a big bully. It's very litigious. It's very secretive. And it's got some celebrities attached to it. So that mix, I think, keeps people very interested. And I, again, I'm just a reporter covering a story, and I've really enjoyed the last 3 years and how exciting it's been to watch this story develop.
Oh, it is. And I'm looking at your website right now at TonyOrtega.org, and one of the top headlines you have on there is Scientology denied. Federal judge finds that Garcia fraud lawsuit can continue. What is that all about?
I mean, that's an example. I try to have it at TonyOrtega.org at my personal website, is where I cover Scientology. I'm also the executive editor of the Raw Story, rawstory.com, where we cover politics. But on my personal website, each day at 7 o'clock Eastern, I try to have a story about some development going on. There's always something going on with Scientology in Europe or Australia or the United States. And part of what I do is cover these various lawsuits that are going on. And so I had my morning story today, which was about something else. On Fridays, my typical thing on Friday is I reveal there's a person that's been smuggling out internal videos that the church has that are not seen by the public, and I've been making those public on Fridays. And I had my typical Friday morning video. But then this afternoon, a judge in Florida released an order regarding a federal fraud lawsuit, and so I jumped on that and broke that story this afternoon. That's about a couple named Luis and Rocio Garcia, who live in California. They were longtime Scientology members who gave hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations, and now they're suing the church for fraud. They're saying that the church pressured them to turn over these donations and lied to them. So, a well-known example from their lawsuit is there's this newish building. It's open now. They were helping to donate to make it happen. It's called the Superpower Building in Florida. Just gigantic edifice. And the Garcias were asked to donate tens of thousands of dollars to pay for the Scientology cross on the top of the building. They found out later that Scientology asked other people to pay for the same thing. So they're suing, saying, look, this was a scam. We got scammed out of money. But their lawsuit has run into various snags, and it's been delayed for several months over a jurisdictional issue. And just today, it's Friday evening as we're having this conversation. Just this afternoon, the judge in the case denied a motion to dismiss the Church of Scientology and is allowing the lawsuit to continue. And it's a big deal because their lawsuit has been held up for several months. A lot of people are watching this lawsuit because it's the first. It's a couple of longtime loyal church members who are suing essentially over the money they gave. There are a lot of other people in this situation who have given money to Scientology and left without getting their money back. And so a lot of people are watching this lawsuit to see if Scientology is forced to give a refund or not. In the world of Scientology, it's a very big deal. So today's decision by that judge is very important. But that's the kind of thing I do at my website is there are dozens of lawsuits that we're watching around the country and around the world. And as soon as there's a new development, you're going to hear about it probably at my blog first. And so that's the kind of thing I do.
Wow. And another thing that I find incredible is you say that this has really been happening since 2010. It's as if there was some type of I don't know even how to put it. Like they want somebody's going after Scientology in a sense. It appears now that's what some people speculate. I don't know what to believe. Is that true? Because a lot of our listeners have actually speculated on that.
Scientology is going through a lot of changes, and they're decades in the making. Like I said, it's in the grips of a crisis, like the grips of a crisis that it's never experienced before. Scientology's very existence is on the line here. And it's really because of several different things that are all happening at the same time. But the number one thing, and it's really a remarkable thing about Scientology, Scientology is the invention of a man named L. Ron Hubbard. Very, very interesting man who led an incredibly adventurous life and came up with this philosophy and built this organization, built this movement. But he died in January 1986. I would say most of the time when you have an organization like this that's based so much around its founder, I mean, to this day, they consider everything he said to be absolute truth. Usually it's hard for an organization like that to survive the death of its founder. But what happened was a young man named David Miscavige took over upon the death of Hubbard. And he's done a remarkable job keeping this thing going. But over time, he has had a hard time because he's run into some difficulties. And I would say the number one problem he faces is that when Hubbard was alive and the people who followed him had gone through all of his processes and bought all of his courses and paid for all of his books, he could always publish something new. You know, he could publish a new book he wanted everyone to buy. He could publish a new course for everyone to take. And you know, in the 60s and 70s, he kept coming up with higher and higher levels for them to purchase. Well, he's dead now. And Scientologists are adamant. Only what Hubbard wrote is what is essential Scientology philosophy. So David Miscavige is running this organization, but he can't add to the philosophy. David Miscavige tomorrow cannot come out with a new level or a new book. And so it's been interesting over the last 20 years to watch as he's tried to keep people focused as he can't really add anything new. So, for example, in 2007, a very controversial thing he did was he republished all of the most basic texts that Hubbard had written in the 50s and 60s, and he called it the Basics. And he required all Scientologists to buy these new sets of books. They're called the Basics. Everyone had to buy the Basics. It was books and lectures, and one set of these books and lectures cost $3,000. And Scientologists were required to buy multiple copies. I've talked to many Scientologists who said that their garages were filled with pallets of these things because they were under so much pressure to buy these books. And all of them already had the previous versions. You see what I'm saying? They were forced to buy. They were forced to buy these books that, you know. But there's a very famous video of Miscavige introducing this, and one of the things he literally boasted about was that when they went back and supposedly improved or cleaned up these books, one of the things they did was they took out a lot of semicolons. They even had, and that's worth dollars. I mean, imagine if you were told, I don't care if you have a copy of Moby Dick on the shelf. You have to buy a new $30 version because we took some semicolons out. I mean, that's basically what Scientologists were faced with in 2007. They not only had to buy these books, but they had to sell them. A lot of people who are leaving Scientology today will tell you that that's when they started having serious doubts. But he's done it again. Now he's come out with a new set of technology he calls the Golden Age of Technology Phase 2, which requires a new e-meter, a brand new machine, all new materials. And I don't know how he managed to pull this off. Remember I told you there's levels in Scientology. They get higher and higher, they get more and more expensive. He has convinced the Scientologists who are in the church today that no matter how high they are on that scale, they have to go back and repeat very low-level processing, the objectives, the purif, something called the survival rundown. These are things that are studied. They have to do the student hat. It's called the student hat. These are things they probably did in their first or second year of Scientology. I'm talking people who've been in 30 or 40 years. And they're being asked to go back and redo those things because they're told that now everything's better or something. I mean, he is struggling because he cannot say, hey, guess what? I've had a revelation and here's a brand new process that we're all going to do. He has to keep convincing them that they've got to go back and redo things they've done before. It's led to a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of disaffection, And in the last 5 years, we've seen a massive exodus of longtime Scientologists leaving. And he's trying to cover that up by replacing people with buildings. In the last 10 years, he's been pushing this program he calls the Ideal Org. In Scientology, the church is called an org, short for organization. And in every big city in the world, there's going to be a Scientology org, and they tended to be utilitarian and nothing fancy, but they were, in the 70s, they were filled with people. Today, they're not. Now, Scientologists are being asked to donate huge sums of money so that they can purchase a fancier building, spend millions more to renovate it, to fill it with all kinds of audiovisual displays, and then then he comes to town and has this grand opening and says, we've opened the new Ideal Org of Madrid, or we've opened the new Ideal Org of Sydney. That's the one they're opening right now in Sydney, Australia. Probably right this minute it's going on. And so that he and his spokeswoman, Karen Powell, whenever they're asked a question by the press, they automatically start saying Scientology's never had more expansion than ever. We have 43 new churches around the world. Well, they have new buildings, but these buildings are empty. They're driving away people. So it's a really tough moment for Scientology right now, and you see it in many different ways. I cover it in several different ways on my blog. Also, the former spokesman of Scientology, Mike Rinder, does a great job specifically covering the dwindling numbers. If you go to his, I think it's Mike Rinder's blog.com. Let me double check that. But his blog is excellent because I cover a lot of different things. I cover the law. It's MikeRindersblog.org. MikeRindersblog.org. I cover a lot of different things. I cover lawsuits. I cover Narcanon. I cover celebrity stuff sometimes. But Mike he does a real good job just focusing on getting internal emails out to show just how difficult a time they're having right now, getting people to come to events, getting people to spend money. And see, that's the key thing about Scientology. It's about money. It's a very expensive pursuit. They target people who have cash, and you cannot be a Scientologist and be poor. It just doesn't work. And they're having a hard time bringing in people that are willing to spend that kind of cash.
Well, and, let me ask you this, as far as the different levels go, Tom Cruise is probably one of the more famous Scientologists, and you hear about the different seed vaults and bunkers that they have around the world. What is the basic beliefs of Scientology? What do people study or get into, and how does that change as they move up the pyramid, I guess you could say?
Yeah, let me talk about the basic beliefs, but remind me to get back to the vaults. There's been some bad information about the vaults and the celebrities that I want to clear up when we get to that. But basic beliefs. Look, L. Ron Hubbard in 1950 came out with a book called Dianetics. And in that book, which I blogged from cover to cover, if you want to learn about every chapter in Dianetics, you can find that at my blog. In 1950, L. Ron Hubbard said this. He said, I have discovered the way the human mind actually works. And he said it was the biggest discovery since the discovery of fire. That's how big he said it was. And he said essentially that the human mind had two parts, the analytical mind and the reactive mind. The analytical mind was this perfect recording computer. And our problem is that we have this ability to have some really superhuman potential and remember everything that happens to us in minute detail, but we get messed up. There's problems in our head. It's called the reactive mind. It prevents us from using that analytical computer. The reactive mind takes over when we're traumatized, when we're unconscious, and then that gets recorded perfectly, but it gets interpreted in a real literal way that's harmful to us. So, for example, he loved examples from the womb. He literally believed that the things that are bothering you today and bothering me today are resulting from what happened when we were in our mother's womb. And, dad runs into mom, knocks the fetus unconscious. Dad and mom have an argument, and the words they say are then absorbed by the fetus and misinterpreted. 30 years later, something happens in our lives to re-stimulate that incident, and suddenly we have problems in our lives and we don't know where it's from. But Hubbard says if we go through a talk therapy processing, we can figure out what that original upset was, talk it out, lessen the impact, and it won't bother us. So, for example, he talks about mom and dad having an argument, screaming at each other, and saying particular words, and 40 years later, a guy has an ulcer because his reactive mind has misinterpreted something his father said to his mother. Now, this came out. That's the essence of Dianetics, and it came out in 1950. It was an immediate success, huge success. People around the country bought it. They were intrigued by it. They formed clubs and started helping each other try to remember what had happened to them in the womb. And if you see the movie The Master, they have a few moments in there where they illustrate this beautifully, where people are trying to help each other remember. And it's not just, Hubbard talks about being a sperm cell or an egg cell and having memories in that time. Now, of course, the problem is there's absolutely no scientific evidence that any of this is true at all. Hubbard claimed to have done research, but nobody's ever found it. It was a brief fad, this idea that you could go back in the womb and remember when mom and dad were having rough sex, which, believe me, that is his primary example, time and time again in Dianetics. He's talking about mom and dad having rough sex when you're in the womb, and also mom trying to abort you. Hubbard believed that every woman in America tried to abort her baby 20 or 30 times. I mean, it's bizarre. And it's been suggested to me numerous times that Hubbard was just sort of talking about his own beliefs about his own childhood or whatever. But that's what he believed. That's what Dianetics was. That fad lasted for about 5 months and died. By that time, Hubbard had started various foundations that had bills. He went bankrupt. By 1951, a year after Dianetics came out, he was bankrupt. He and his second wife were going through a bitter divorce. He had absconded with his daughter that he had with his second wife to Cuba, while she was talking to the LA Times about how insane he was. I mean, 1951 was a nightmare for L. Ron Hubbard. He got very fortunate in that there was a Kansas millionaire who took pity on him and helped him get out of bankruptcy, helped him get back on his feet. He then went to Phoenix in 1952 and started over again. The problem was he couldn't use the word Dianetics at that point. It was still in bankruptcy court. So he came up with a new name and called it Scientology. That's the history of it. And then later he had to reconcile Dianetics and Scientology. It got very complex. But Scientology was started in 1952 in Phoenix as Hubbard was trying to pick up the pieces. Now, by that time, the people that were still with him, and it was a very small group, very small number of followers by that point, those people weren't satisfied with just going back to the womb. They wanted to go farther. And so where do you go back before the womb? You go to previous lives, right? And so Hubbard knew that some of his followers really liked the idea that they could keep doing this talk therapy, this mental processing, and discover what they had done in previous lives, going back centuries. But he also knew that one of the things that made Dianetics attractive in 1950 was that Hubbard at this point was still telling people that this was a science. This was the modern science of mental health. It was all scientific. He was talking about these traumatic memories he called engrams, and he said they were literally in the protoplasm of cells. I mean, he was using scientific language. He knew that if he started talking about past lives on other planets, he would lose a lot of those early believers, early followers who believed that he had discovered a new science. And that's what the movie The Master is all about. So I know it confused some people, but I thought Paul Thomas Anderson did a great job. That's the point of the movie The Master, is that the Hubbard character is trying to deal with the fact that if he embraces past lives, he's going to lose some of his early supporters. And Hubbard did lose some of them, but he embraced the past lives thing, and that's when Dianetics started in 52. But he was still running into trouble with the government because not only was he telling people that this talk therapy, this processing, could get them back to past lives, but that once you discovered what terrible thing had happened to you 5 lives ago, a couple hundred years ago, or thousands of years ago, if you could figure out what terrible thing had happened to you back then and talk about it and lessen its impact, then your life would get better to the point where he believed that almost all diseases, for example, were the result of this mental process. So he was offering cures. He was saying that once you cleared away, wiped away this reactive mind that was holding you back, you then became what's called clear. And that was the early goal of Dianetics and Scientology, was you wanted to go clear and become this perfect analytical mind. You'd have total recall, and you'd be impervious to disease. So he was making health claims. And by 1953, the U.S. government was paying attention. The FDA was not happy. And so Hubbard realized that he couldn't keep doing what he was doing. He needed a change because he was, making claims that his science could cure you of just about anything. So in 1953, he wrote a letter to a supporter. And you can see it, it's online, it's on the internet. And in this letter, he says, let's try the religion angle. He literally says it, let's try the religion angle. So, and longtime Scientologists will tell you today, the longtime people that came out will tell you, when they were in the Scientology in the 70s and 80s, they were still talking about it like it was a science. And all this stuff about a church and a religion was strictly for the lawyers, strictly to keep the government off their backs. And so that's why in December 1953, L. Ron Hubbard and his son and a few other people drew up the corporation papers for the first Church of Scientology. It was in Camden, New Jersey. It was December 16, 1953, if I'm not incorrect. And then a few months later, in February 1954, he asked some followers to create another Church of Scientology in Los Angeles. That's the one that became the mother church, and that's why most people say that Scientology has been a church since 1954. Actually, he formed the first church corporation in 53 in New Jersey. But anyway, the one in Los Angeles, 1954, became the mother church. And so it talked about itself as if it was a church. And it's ever since then they've talked about it like it was a church and a religion. But the actual processes of Scientology to this day are centered around the idea that you and I are immortal beings who have existed for trillions and trillions of years through countless lives. And we've lost sight of that because of this reactive mind. And if we go through the Dianetic processes and wipe that away, we will begin to see our true nature, and we'll be able to go back along that whole track of existence and re-experience the things that happened to us 10 million, 20 billion years ago on other planets and other galaxies. And that will help us understand why today we have arthritis or why today we have an ulcer. It's because of something that happened to us on a planet 20 million years ago. That is the essential belief of Scientology. Now, celebrities who have been recruited into the church have been trained not to talk about that. They all, if you ask Tom Cruise or Kirstie Alley or John Travolta or, Jenna Elfman, what is Scientology? They're not going to tell you, oh, I go through processing to remember what happened to me 10 million years ago on another planet. What they're going to say is, it's really helped my life. It unlocks your potential. Go get a book and read it. And you can right now look up videos, and it's the exact same thing that Tom Cruise and John Travolta say. Read a book and find out for yourself. But I've talked to actors who have left Scientology, and they tell me that's what they're trained to say. You will never see Tom Cruise actually talk about the processing that they do. And when I tell you that this is the processing they do, I'm not basing this only on what people have told me. Everything Hubbard ever wrote is available today on the internet. You can find virtually all of it. And there's just no question that that is what Scientologists believe, and those are the processes they go through.
So as far as Mr. Hubbard goes and his connections to some, I guess you could say, powerful leaders of their time or figures, more like occult figures such as Aleister Crowley, and then there was Richard Parsons, and they had some connections. What was their, what did they have involved together?
Yeah, that came out in 1969. It was a big revelation about what Hubbard had done before Dianetics. Hubbard was born in 1911 in Nebraska. His family moved around a lot. He was in Montana for a while. He ended up in the Seattle area. His father was in the Navy and was stationed in Guam, so Hubbard went out there as a teenager to Asia. He got to do a lot of traveling and experienced a lot of things growing up. And like his dad, he was attracted to the Navy. So when World War II started, he became a lieutenant and had a very strange World War II experience. We can talk about that later, but not a distinguished World War II experience. Very disappointing for him. But in 1945, he was, the war was over. He found himself in California. He was in Los Angeles, and I think it was on a recommendation of a friend. He went to this Pasadena house owned by an early rocket scientist by the name of Jack Parsons, John Whiteside Parsons, known as Jack Parsons. Jack was a Caltech rocket scientist. He built JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he's famous today. And there's been some really good research about him lately that has nothing to do with Hubbard, but he's well known because he had this large house in Pasadena, and he liked to rent out the rooms, but only to other eccentrics. Jack was an occultist. He was totally into the occult, in particular the Thelema movement of Aleister Crowley, a very famous British occultist of the time. And at the time when Hubbard first arrived, Jack's girlfriend was a woman named Betty Northrup, and Hubbard almost immediately stole her away. But Jack didn't mind. He was a very liberal-minded guy, right? And so Hubbard moved in and got really, this is 45, 46. Hubbard got very involved with Parsons in his occult experiments. In particular, they, under the influence of Crowley, they set out to do some rituals of this occult group that they believed would create a moon child, some kind of special child. I don't, there are people who are into this stuff today that get real angry when Scientology researchers talk about this, because it's not our primary field, and they're going to get angry if I tell you that this was all crazy sex magic occult stuff. But it was. They wrote it down. They described their rituals. Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard had these wild sex magic rituals where Parsons needed to find the perfect woman for this. He found this woman named Marjorie Cameron, and they described it. He, basically, Parsons had sex with Cameron while Hubbard took notes, and everyone was chanting and doing crazy stuff. I don't know the exact. The point is, there's no question that in 1945 and 1946, L. Ron Hubbard got into some pretty kinky sex magic rituals with a rocket scientist named Jack Parsons. Shortly after that, it all fell apart because they had this scheme where they were going to buy a yacht in California. Hubbard was going to sail it over to Florida and then sell it for a profit, and then he and Jack were going to split the proceeds. Anyway, it turned out that, Jack accused Hubbard of stealing from him, and they sued each other and whatever. Their relationship ended. Parsons blew himself up in a laboratory explosion accident a couple years later. So, 52, I think it was. So what's fascinating for those of us who study Scientology is that Hubbard had that experience in 1946 with Parsons. He took this. That's where he met Betty Northrup, became his second wife. They had a child, and they had a child in 1950, the same time he produced Dianetics. And then in 52, like I said, he starts to develop Scientology. There's an academic named Hugh Urban that's done some real good work on this, where he compared what were Aleister Crowley's beliefs and his set of ideas and levels and magic, and then you look at what Hubbard then came up with in the 50s and 60s as he developed Scientology, and the parallels are just incontrovertible. There's just no question that Hubbard just took ideas wholesale from Crowley and the occult, including the cross. If you've ever seen the Scientology cross, it sort of looks like a Christian cross. It's got all these extra things on it, and it's the exact same cross that Crowley was using for his occult. So I think there's no question that Hubbard was heavily influenced by Crowley and the occult, and it helped him come up with the ideas for Scientology. Now, there are people today that say that gave Scientology a satanic influence or something. I think that's exaggeration. I think the point was that there's no question that Hubbard borrowed a lot of ideas from a lot of different places in order to come up with this incredibly complex thing that we know as Scientology. I mean, he wrote just, volume after volume after volume of material from that. And definitely a lot of it came from his occult background. Now, Scientology, this is not a kind of history they like to talk about. And they came up with this cover story that Hubbard was actually working for naval intelligence and had gotten involved with black magic in order to break it up. He was sent in as a spy, which nobody buys that. I mean, there's just no question. He was into it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I mean, him and Jack Parsons chanting and looking through occult books and probably they were on some substances. Who knows? What's wrong with that? Sounds like let them have a good time. But I think the only problem is that Scientology denies it because there's no, they left their writings behind. We could read about the rituals they were going through. There's just no question they did that kind of thing.
Wow, that's some blockbuster information there, Tony. That's a lot of stuff, It's
been around a long time. Like I said, it was 1969 when that first came out, and it's been written. Lawrence Wright in his recent book Going Clear did some really excellent stuff on that. Russell Miller in his 1987 book described it very well. But then one of my favorite parts of Lawrence Wright's book, Going Clear, that came out a year and a half ago, was how well he handled that material. He did a great job on that. It's been around. It's been in court cases. There's just no question about it. And and it's online. You can find all that information online.
So, and another thing that I've heard about is something called e-beaters.
Yeah.
So what are those about, and why exactly do people in Scientology need them?
Yeah, if you look at Dianetics, the 1950 book, there's no machine involved. It's just you and another person asking questions to help them remember what life was like in the womb, right? Like I said. Then as you read that book, Hubbard tries to get more and more technical about how to ask questions, how to know whether you're asking the right questions. And, he says that it takes a lot of skill to be a good auditor, it's called, and ask the right questions and help the person remember things. About a year later, 51, I think, he ran into this device that another man had invented, and he decided that it would be an excellent way to assist in that process. And it's called the electropsychometer or e-meter. And this is another thing that I'm going to say that's going to anger some ex-Scientologists, but electrical engineers have looked at this thing, Rex, and it's the most crude device you can imagine. It's based on what's called a Wheatstone bridge, and all it does is measure tiny fluctuations in current that are going through your skin. Okay? You're holding on to the two sensors that are hooked up to the machine. It puts a tiny current of electricity through you, and then it measures tiny fluctuations. Now, a scientist will tell you that current can be affected by a number of different things. How hard you grip those sensors, whether your hands are sweaty or not, how much salt content in your sweat. All these things are factors that could make the machine react. And the way it reacts is it has a big needle, right? In the age of digital electronics, who's still using big needles, right? But they do. So they got this big needle that's flying back and forth. And, it's measuring this tiny little thing in your skin. They believe, however, that their thoughts have mass and that the meter is literally reading their minds. And so if an auditor asks you a word, they'll just give you lists of words, and they'll wait to see if the needle reacts. And so if they say the word yellow and the needle reacts, they'll say, what was that? What are you remembering? And then they'll ask you to go, what was it about the word yellow? And they're convinced that there's something buried deep inside your mind, that the meter is always, the meter is infallible. And if you can't remember something that's bothering you about the word yellow or some phrase they've given you, maybe it's in a past life. And they'll make you go back and back and back until 10 million years ago. Oh, yeah, I was wearing yellow when somebody killed me in a war or something, Oh, that's what it is. Okay, great. Let's go to the next word. And they're convinced that this machine is so sensitive that it will be able to detect when you're trying to hide something like that. I would, look, if they're convinced it works, then it's going to work. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if the interrogator, the person, the auditor is asking questions, and you don't want to hold, and you've got a secret, and you believe that the machine is going to find out that holding back that secret, then you're going to be in a tough spot to hold that secret back. You see what I'm saying? So it really puts the person being questioned in a tough situation, as long as they believe that it's infallible. So they do. So So the e-meter is essential in all of their processes. It helps. They use it when they're auditing, just trying to find these traumatic incidents and talk about things that bother them to help them, in their life. But it's also used in what they call security checking or sec checking. And that's when they just interrogate the hell out of you. They want to know everything about your sex life, about any crimes you've committed. And all Scientologists have to go through these at one point, time or another. And, imagine they're asking you if you've ever masturbated, if you've ever paid for a prostitute, if you've ever raped someone, if you've ever had an abortion, if you've ever had sex with somebody of a different race. These are all questions in their standard list, which I can show you. Imagine if you're holding those cans and you believe that you cannot fool the machine. Well, what do? They give up everything. I mean, I've talked to a lot of ex-Scientologists that tell me there are no secrets in Scientology. They are going to find out everything about you. And of course, the whole time they're asking you these incredibly invasive questions, they're writing down whatever you say. And they're keeping these massive files on you. Everybody in Scientology has these massive paper. Again, they're stuck in the 50s and 60s. They're still not even digitizing this stuff. It's all in paper, all these paper files. So, Tom Cruise has got file after file after file of things that he admitted to using this machine. So, on the one hand, it's a joke. It's a crude device that is like, an analog machine with 1950s technology that is completely useless. On the other hand, because they believe it's so effective, it is just an incredible interrogation tool that forces Scientologists to give up their inner secrets.
Well, and that brings me to my next question. With all that information, especially from people that have a lot of money and power, people in politics, those in the media, what do they do with that information? Do they use it in some type of blackmail situation, or?
Well, that's the allegation made by a lot of ex-Scientologists. I mean, they'll tell you that, and a lot of them get in very young, or they're born into it, and they don't know any better. They're just, okay, I'll tell you about anything you want to know. And so people talk about, they call them crimes, just what we would call indiscretions, they call crimes. And so here you are over your career, you're auditing, you're being sec-checked, they're building up these files, you've got all this information. Well, let's say at that point you want to leave. You've had enough. You don't like this organization anymore. They let you know they've got all that information, and they're not going to turn over your files to you. So people leave. Most of them keep quiet, and you can see why, right? They don't dare speak out about the organization. For every person that I talk to and name on my website, there are 20 more people that I talk to whose name you'll never know. Right? These people are terrified. They don't want to say a thing. But let's say you go public. Let's say you go public and say, this organization, here are the allegations of abuse. They do all these terrible things. All of a sudden, that information that you told them in confidence, using the e-meter that was written down in files, suddenly it shows up in an anonymous website somewhere. How does that happen? I mean, this happens a lot, and you can talk to people like Mike Rinder, former spokesperson of the church, Marty Rathman, former top, number 2 guy in the church, Lori Hodgson, who was a longtime member of Scientology, and they can point to you these anonymous websites that have these smear websites that have this disgusting material about them that they told in confidence to the church. And in the last couple of years, Scientology has come closer and closer to admitting that they are behind those websites. Karen Powell, the current spokesperson for the church, admitted to the Hollywood Reporter last year that the church supplies information to those websites. They're not quite ready to admit that they're behind them, but these websites are anonymous. They're just like they're disgusting. They're disgusting websites that attack critics of the church, and you can't trace who they're from, and they contain disinformation. One example that always comes to my mind is Placido Domingo Jr. He's the son of the great tenor, and he was a Scientologist. And he decided he he was kind of halfway out of the church, and his ex-wife, Sam Domingo, was all the way out, and she was visiting Marty Rathbun, the former top guy, and so the church came to Placido Jr. and said, look, you need to cut off all contact with your ex-wife because she's saying bad things about the church. Well, he was like, no, look, she might be my ex-wife, but we're raising 3 daughters together. We're still friends. I'm not going to cut off contact. You can't tell me to do that. All of a sudden, this anonymous website that he showed me had information about some indiscretions of his that he had only told to his counselor, his auditor, under strict confidence. They immediately leaked it. And this goes back decades. I mean, you can look at the court cases. Before the internet, they would leak information to reporters. They would print flyers and spread information about people. So this is what keeps so many ex-Scientologists quiet, is they know that if they leave and speak out, this incredibly personal information that they divulged will suddenly become public. And they do it to all kinds of people. There's so many examples. And it's really disgusting. Especially since they want to be known as a church. What kind of church does that to people? Creates anonymous websites and smears them with information they thought they were saying in confidence.
I have heard, and from some of the articles that I've read, it's more difficult to, or the questions that they ask you and the questionnaires to be a part of Scientology and what you have to go through is more, they get into more private stuff than if you were to work for the military and apply for a security clearance or something.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, especially look, you're not going to have to go through quite that much if you're just a public Scientologist, okay? If you're just somebody that wants to take some courses and pays them for some courses, you're not going to go through that kind of interrogation until you get fairly high up. I think it's expanded grade 2 is when you first go through your first sec check and things get serious. But it's the people who work for the church, who join something called the Sea Organization. Those people really go through intense interrogation about their lives. If you're going to join the Sea Org, and most of them join in when they're 12 or 13 or 15, you have to fill out something called a life history. And this is what you're talking about. You're right. Obviously, if you're going to join the military and get a sensitive job, they're going to do a deep background check on you, no question. But this is a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old who just wants to work for the church. They're given this questionnaire, and I posted a copy of it on my website, with incredibly invasive questions. They want to know the name of every sexual partner you have had. And when they're talking to 14 to 15-year-olds, they mean anybody you've kissed, okay? You have to, I can show you the form where they fill it out. Okay, yeah, they'll ask a 14-year-old girl, yes, Jim was my boyfriend, and we did some kissing, and they want to know the name and phone number, and I've seen some, and it's called a life history. I've seen some life histories of people in their 20s and 30s. They have to put a lot of information down, right? And they have to discuss their masturbation habits. They have to talk about every kind of sex they've had. And then once they fill out that life history, then they're further questioned with the e-meter to make sure they haven't held anything back. I was leaked a few dozen copies of these actual life histories and follow-up interrogations. And they're just disgusting. I mean, no employer should have any reason to know this stuff, right? I mean, your private life is your private life. I wanted people to see how disgusting this was, so I didn't want to re-victimize these people. So I made sure it just excerpted small portions so that the people would be unrecognizable. But I wanted them. My website is the first one that's ever revealed any of this material, and I showed excerpts from some of these life histories to show what these young people were asked to admit to before they could join a church organization. I mean, it's just so disgusting, and nothing like it anywhere else in the American religion. And it's one of those things that you kind of have to be deep into studying about Scientology that you even hear about this kind of thing. But I have posted Sea Org life histories. If you search under TonyOrtega.org, Sea Org life histories, I'm sure you'll find it, and you'll be shocked. I mean, this is what people are asked to admit to simply so they can work for the church. They're not accused of any wrongdoing. They're not being investigated for any specific crime. you have to talk about your early sexual experiences and your masturbation habits to get a job for this church. It's so strange. And you're right. It's almost like they were going to work for, the most sensitive government agency. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all unless you think of what they might possibly do with that information to keep control.
Exactly, because your name when a young Sea Org member is discussing his or her sexual experiences and is naming the people that they've been having some experiences with, they tend to be other Scientologists. So they're now building more and more information about the sexual histories of every single person that is in the organization. And they use this information. They use it against people. One of L. Ron Hubbard's favorite concepts was the idea of leverage. If you've ever seen Battlefield Earth, one of the worst movies ever made in the history of mankind, John Travolta's character, Turl, again and again talks about getting leverage on people. That is straight out of the L. Ron Hubbard playbook. He did not want to just, as his son said, L. Ron Hubbard Jr. Told Penthouse Magazine, 1983. L. Ron Hubbard did not just want to, defeat you or make you go away. Whoever he decided was an enemy, he wanted to crush you. He wasn't satisfied until you had lost your job, lost your family, lost your house, and you were lying in a gutter somewhere drunk. That's when L. Ron Hubbard would finally be satisfied that he had destroyed you. So you see that in everything this church does, that all of these policies were set in the 60s. In the mid-60s, Hubbard became incredibly paranoid about splinter groups, about outside influences, and he developed what he called ethics. It's one of these incredibly erotic concepts of Scientology. Ethics is Scientology's word for control. And they developed all these processes, one of which is get as much information about somebody as you possibly can, including all their sexual partners, all the people that they owe money to, and things like that. And that's also what's in those life histories. Who do you owe money to? Are you a reporter? Have you ever been a part of the Communist Party? I mean, that's the other funny thing is it's all kind of Scientology is stuck in about 1965. Okay, and it cannot change. Hubbard died, and they can't change any of his words. So if you're ever curious about why Scientology is doing a particular thing, just remember, oh yeah, that made sense when they were still using telexes and typewriters and telephones, and it's just stuck in the past. Wow. And it's stuck in the Cold War past. I mean, it's literally a very sort of Soviet attitude about control, about leverage, about making sure that Scientology is able to crush anyone that speaks ill of them. And that's what they still do the same playbook today.
Well, and you talk about how much money you have to move up the ladder. So, what is the highest ladder as of right now? Because obviously they can just add them whenever they want. But, how many millions of dollars does it take to get there?
They can't add anymore. See, that's why I said David Miscavige is in a tough position, is that, yeah, in the 60s and 70s, Hubbard just kept adding levels and getting more expensive. But then he died. And now they can't add anything. But I was curious about that, too, because I think most people who have a basic understanding of Scientology know that it involves these various levels and they get more expensive. But how many levels and how expensive? And so what I did starting about a year ago on my website was I started doing this series called Up the Bridge, and I started out with Claire Headley, who's really knowledgeable, wonderful ex-Scientologist. She was so knowledgeable about what they call the technology. She was the supervisor over the person who was auditing Tom Cruise, okay? And so she and I started from the very beginning, and each week we would go through another level. And when you very first start out, it's free. The next week, maybe $50. I mean, it starts out very inexpensive. But she was explaining how even in those low levels, that they start laying in the idea that Scientology has all the answers, that you really need to ignore the outside world, that even the basic understandings of what words mean, you have to trust Scientology. All these kind of ideas are being laid in very early on, but it's not very expensive. But then it keeps getting more and more expensive. Right now on that series, we're past OT7. And what that means is Initially, you went through several layers of processing to go clear, it's called. And it was very simple. If you read Dianetics, the very first book in 1950, Hubbard estimated that it would take about 20 hours of processing and you'd be clear. Well, now it takes years, right? And you go through various levels to get to clear. Once you become clear, then you move on to something called the operating thetan levels. As I said, Scientologists believe that we're all immortal beings, and it's called a thetan. Sounds like Satan, but with a TH. And each one of us is a thetan that's ancient, trillions of years old. But once we go clear and get some concept of ourselves as a thetan, we still don't have real control over all the superhuman powers we could have. So that comes as you go in the operating thetan levels, OT1, OT2, OT3, up to OT8. OT8 is the absolute top. So far, we've gone through every level up to OT7 on my website. Claire Headley, Bruce Hines, Jeff Hawkins, they've helped me understand. We've gone through the actual materials. No other website has done this. We've actually gone through the actual materials in each level and then had these experts talk about what it was like to go through. And so far, we're at OT7. We're just below the top level of this whole experience. And already, we're close to $500,000, totaling up every level as we went. And that is what people, that's just for the processing. So to get to OT8, the top level of Scientology, it's going to take you 7 or 8 years minimum and $500,000. Now, not everybody has that, right? I mean, it's like I said, it's an expensive pursuit. And what is drawing people through all this, Rex, is this idea that once you get to OT8 and you are an operating thetan, you'll be able to leave your body at will. You'll be able to affect matter with your mind. You'll be able to travel around the world astrally or whatever. You'll be able to create things just with your mind. The problem is no one has demonstrated these powers. Hubbard came up with this in the 60s, and we're still waiting to see somebody that can actually do any of this, right? So you see people that are, so for example, one of the things ex-Scientologists love to point out is, there's another OT8 just died of cancer. They should be, according to what Hubbard was preaching, by the time you're OT8, you should be basically immortal and impervious to disease. So it doesn't make sense that just the other day an OT8 died of cancer. I mean, because you know what? When you're OT8, you're still a human being, and human beings sometimes die of cancer. You see what I'm saying? So but it is very expensive, and that's just the processing. There are other processes outside of the bridge that you can go through. There's this new thing called superpower. There are things called the L rundowns, and whenever you go do these processes, you can't. Some of them you could do locally, but the upper level stuff you have to go to specific places. For the top level stuff, you have to go to Clearwater, Florida, to what they call their Mecca. It's called the Flagland Base, or they just call it Flag. And you have to go to Flag to get these top level processes. And the top level processes cost about $800 an hour. And you have to buy them in 12.5-hour blocks. And, the last one I just talked about on my website was called L10, the L10 rundown. And that takes 5 or 6 intensives. So that rundown all by itself, which would take probably a few weeks, was $72,000. And I showed the actual materials. It's basically sets of words that you're asked about while you're holding the e-meter. From the outside, it just looks ridiculous. But to Scientologists, they're somehow unlocking the secrets of the universe.
Well, and, people like Tom Cruise that is openly into Scientology, and others, it would appear that they're obviously very good at, convincing them psychologically that they're making these incredible decisions. How many people would you say are in? Have you ever researched how many people are in Scientology? They're actual members?
I have, because Scientology is always exaggerated to a ridiculous degree. I found a 1969 article where Scientology was telling the press that they had 15 million people around the world. 15 million in 1969. They backed off on that, and they were saying when I first started writing about Scientology in the 90s, they were talking about having 6 or 8 million. And then by the year, the early 2000s, they said they were up to 10 or 12 million. I think they'd forgotten that back in the 60s, they'd said 15 million. But it was always going up, 6, 8, 10, 12 million people.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of the first half of our broadcast. If you would like to listen to the rest of the show, join us at www.disclosureradio.com. If you sign up and become a member for only $4.99 a month, you will have access to all the latest shows first, in CD quality format, commercial-free, as well as a wide variety of other topics and broadcasts that you will not have access to anywhere else. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. This is Rex Bear with Disclosure Radio. Be safe and have a fantastic evening.